All right, well, in the year 2023, so just this past summer, the B.L.A.S.T Research Group, which is one of the top research organizations in the world, came out with a very fascinating study that they titled the Open Generation. The Open Generation, otherwise known as Gen Z. So mainly targeting kind of 13 to 17-year-olds, but as categories for generations work, it dips further into early elementary or maybe early 20s. But the Open Generation was the title of this study. And it was a massive survey. It involved over 25,000 students across over 20 different countries. And in a report that was written on this research, here's what they concluded. They say that though religious affiliation and church attendance continue to decline, spiritual openness and curiosity are on the rise. Across every generation, in fact, we see an unprecedented desire to grow spiritually, a belief in the spiritual or supernatural dimension, and a belief in a God or some higher power. That's pretty interesting. If you were to go back 10 years ago, I don't think most people would have imagined that a research group like the B.L.A.S.T group would come out with a survey like this. If anything, we would have thought things would have tended in the opposite direction, that atheism and naturalism would have far surpassed any belief in the supernatural or spiritual, or certainly the belief in God and in Christianity. And yet, we're actually seeing the opposite. They say that in every generation, we see this unprecedented desire to grow spiritually, this openness, maybe not necessarily to Christianity, but an openness to the spiritual. Now, that's interesting. And what's also interesting is they found that it might actually be young people that are fueling the rise in spiritual hunger. So Gen Z in this study is found to have the highest spiritual openness of all 6 or 7 current generations. 74% moderately to highly spiritually open. And so we might not have expected this, but here is what the next decade is looking like, that things are tending in a direction of more spiritual openness, and especially among a younger generation, searching for something more than just this material world. And I think the early 20th century philosophers, maybe you'll be familiar, you've probably heard the name Friedrich Nietzsche, right? He's famous for having said that God is dead. He wrote in one of his essays, God is dead. You're familiar with that statement. Well, for him, that was not a cry of triumph or victory, though he wasn't a Christian or a believer himself. Instead, what Nietzsche saw was that the death of God by the atheist secular movement would result in a vacuum of meaning. That we would find a Western world that was hungering for something more, a void that was empty with nothing to fill it. And I think the words of the writer G.K. Chesterton, I think he puts it best when he says, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. They believe in anything to give meaning, anything to give purpose, any kind of transcendent truth that I can tap into and to give me life and sustenance and value. Anything to believe in. This is, I think, where we're at as a culture. Anything to believe in. Atheism is fading, and people are hungering for spiritual meaning, and they're not becoming less religious. They're just becoming religious about different things. And so, if that's true, if that's the case, if we're seeing this sort of decline in atheism and a rise in spiritual openness, then maybe the most important question that you and I could ask in this next decade is not so much whether or not there is a God, but rather what's so great about our God. Or in the words of the song That is the theme for our weekend. What is so great about the great I am? That's the question that we want to answer this weekend. In all of our lessons and all of our studies, and then culminating in Sunday's lesson, we want to answer this question, what is so great about the great I am? But tonight, to start to answer that question, will be in Acts chapter 17. And before we jump in, if I were to ask you, what is the smartest, wisest city by your estimation in America, what city would you choose? Maybe you think hometown, Dallas. Maybe that's what you would choose. Maybe you think West Coast, Bay Area, tech industry, smartest, wisest people. Or maybe you go out east. You think maybe Boston, New York, the hub of industry and innovation. I don't know what you would choose. I'd probably pick my hometown, Houston. But in Paul's day, there was no debate. There was no wondering. There was no questioning what the greatest, most brilliant, smartest, wisest city was. In Paul's day, it was unequivocally the city of Athens. And I have a picture. You can imagine it. Beautiful. This is the ruins of it, still standing today. You can go and visit this very site. But you can imagine the glory of its former days. And it was home to some of the world's most famous philosophers. Aristotle claimed it as his home. It was the home of Plato and Socrates as well. And it was known for the fine arts and natural sciences. It was this booming metropolis, a place that was renowned as wise and is, by many people's estimation, the ancient city that has most shaped our Western world today. This is the city of Athens. And what I want us to see is that the people of Athens are actually a lot like us. So here's I think, a really good parallel here. Acts 17 and verse 21, we'll start here. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling and hearing something new. Does that sound familiar at all? In other words, Athens, the people of Athens were always concerned about what's trending. What's the newest thing? What's the newest fad? What's the newest philosophy? What's on the frontier of science? They were the pioneers of wisdom and thought. That's how they viewed themselves. Always wanting what's new. And this city, while not only being a city that was wise and into the fine arts and sciences, they were also highly open to the spiritual. In fact, people used to say about Athens that it was easier to find a god than a man. The idea that Athens was a forest of idols. And in fact, if you go there today, you can see the altars everywhere upon which these idols once were mounted. A forest of idols open to the spiritual. And so when Paul entered the city, it says this in verse 16, that while Paul was in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. Now think about that for a moment. Why would that be such bad news for Paul? Why would that provoke his spirit? Because in our day, here's kind of how we might think about it. Here's kind of how maybe modern culture would think of it. Why is this not a great thing, a city full of idols? Don't we want to be an open, pluralistic society where we're all accepting and all embracing of whatever you choose? Athens was a you do you culture. You choose whatever God. You've got a forest of idols to choose from. You've got some God that you're going to be able to connect with and resonate with and find meaning and power and life from. Something to find worth and purpose in. And so you do you. You choose what you wish to serve. Why is that not a great thing? This tolerance, this openness. Well, I think the reason Paul was moved, why his spirit was provoked within him, is because he realized something that I think you and I, or at least our culture, tends to forget. And that is, while The freedom to choose is a good and valuable thing. Whatever you choose to worship becomes your master. Whatever you choose to worship becomes your master. And as Paul describes in places like Romans 1, when we choose to worship the creature rather than the Creator, when we choose to worship idols or other powers or gods, when we choose to worship anything but the true Creator, it has a way of enslaving us and dehumanizing us. And this isn't just something that the Apostle Paul recognized. This is something that even secular people have pointed out. So in a 2005 commencement speech, David Foster Wallace, who was a postmodern novelist, by no means a Christian, but he said this in this commencement speech, which is fascinating. He says, "Here's something that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing," he says, "as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship." He says, pretty much anything you worship will eat you alive. Haven't you found that to be true? The places that you turn to other than God, they tend to just take from us, right? They promise to give life, but they instead continually solicit your continued sacrifice and devotion. They become enslaving. And he gives some examples. He continues on to say, worship money and things. If they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel that you have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally grieve you. Worship power, he says, and you'll feel forever weak and afraid, and you'll need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. And on it goes. Whatever you worship, he says, tends to eat you alive. And this is why Paul's spirit was provoked within him. That the gods, they promise to give what you most want, but in the end, they take all that you have to give. And so, as Paul's spirit is provoked within him, he decides to not sit by, but he takes action. He says, all right, I'm going to go to the synagogue of the Jews, and I'm going to go to the marketplace every day with those who happen to be gathered there. And some of the philosophers said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because it says he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Now click save on that. He was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. But this is interesting. In a world full of idols, Paul preached this. Paul believes that the story of Jesus and the resurrection sets him apart from the other gods. That in a forest of idols, Paul decides to preach the cross and the resurrection as that which sets Jesus as God apart from these other deities in this city. Now think about that. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But as he reasons with them, preaching Jesus and the resurrection, they decide they want to know about this. And so they took him and they brought him to the Areopagus. And this is where the city leaders would take counsel. This is where the philosophers would gather to exchange ideas. They take him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know this new teaching that you're presenting to us, right? Always about something new. Always the new idea that's trending. They want to know what it is. And so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, says something so powerful. He says, men of Athens, gathered with the smartest, brightest intellectuals of his day, men of Athens, I perceive in every way that you are very religious. not superstitious, not playing in a world that you know nothing about, but that you are devout. He says, I see that. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. So much could be said about that title, to the unknown God. But it's as if here in the city of Athens, the people feel like something is missing, that something is out of place. Here they are, a city full of idols, where it's easier to find a God than a man, so spiritually open, so many sources of power and meaning to tap into and find purpose and worth in. And yet, it's not enough. Something is still missing, this unknown God. And I feel like that is descriptive of so many people today. People may not think of things as idols or gods that we worship, but there are so many sources from which we derive meaning and purpose and value and worth. And here we are in the most advanced civilization with all the wisdom and resources of the world at our fingertips. And yet, it's not enough. There's still something missing. There's that belief that there must be more. Not belief in nothing, but belief in anything. There's got to be something more than this unknown God. And that's why what Paul says next is so powerful. He says, what you worship as unknown, all these sources through which you're trying to find meaning and value and purpose, and you going beyond trying to find this unknown, that piece that's missing, he says, I know this unknown God to you, and I proclaim to you that the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. No, Paul says, he himself gives. Now think about that. All the idols of the Greco-Roman world, all these idols that they were worshiping, what do? They take. They rob. They eat you alive. The more you give, it's never enough. They rob more and more. But the Lord of heaven and earth, he says he gives life and breath and everything. And he says from one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, having marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. So this is not a distant, distracted deity who is disinterested in our world and human affairs. No, what Paul describes is a God who is intimately involved, guiding human history and creation itself toward a telos, toward a goal, toward an end for its goodness and flourishing. A God who is involved in the very fabric of everything that's going on in human affairs. And he says that God did this. God arranged the world in this way so that they would seek him and perhaps feel their way toward him. And this is descriptive of so many people today, right? This image of finding your way, feeling your way through the darkness, knowing that there must be more than this, but not knowing where to turn, this unknown God. He says, God arranged it this way so that they should feel their way toward him and not come to an empty search, not come to realize that he's so other, that he's so holy and distant from them that they can never ascend the top of the mountain. No, he says, so that they would find him, though he's not far from any one of us. And then he says this, for in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Now, we should just sit and meditate with that for a moment. I don't know how you maybe have thought of God in the past, but for me, I got the impression growing up, for whatever reason, that God was distant. It was as if he created the world like a clockmaker and then kind of took his hands away and just let history run its course. But that's not the God of the Bible. That's not the God that Paul describes here. He describes a God who is intimately involved in our lives and in the course of human history. That he's not distant, that he's not disinterested in what we're doing, but that he is, in fact, near to us. That he is close to us, that in him we live and move and have our being. And as awesome as that is in and of itself, Paul, I think, is actually doing something even more profound here. When he says, some of your poets have said, I have highlighted the part from which Paul quotes one of their poets, Epimenides. And Epimenides wrote around the year 600 BC, and this would have been soaked into the minds and imaginations of the people gathered listening to Paul at this Areopagus address. And as I read the rest of this quote from Epimenides that would have been fresh on their minds, see if it sounds familiar at all to you. Epimenides writes, "They fashioned a tomb for thee, O high and holy one. But thou art not dead. Thou livest and abidest forever. For in thee we live and move and have our being." Do you see what Paul is doing here? Here he stands in this historic city, the city of Athens, at the top of this Areopagus with the best and brightest philosophers of his day gathered to listen, and he quotes from their very own poets to say, I can not only turn to the Hebrew Scriptures and show you that this is the one true God, but I can turn to your own poets and show how all of human history and every culture and nation, tribe, language, and tongue points to Jesus as the one true and living God. That the unknown God that you're searching for has made himself known in the person of Jesus, the true, high, and holy one. And although he was laid in a tomb, although there was prepared and fashioned for him a tomb, the true, high, and holy one, he lives and abides forever. For in him we live and move and have our being. Or maybe we could say it like this: our God, he is alive. In him we live and we survive. And so, before we go, what difference does this make here in 2024? Why does this matter, especially to young people today? What difference does this make to know that Jesus is the one in whom we live and move and have our being? Well, I think there's so much to be said, and we'll discover that throughout the rest of this weekend. But I want to close with this one key idea. This is the one key thing. That which all humanity so deeply tries to find is found in the person of Jesus, who came to find you. That which all humanity so desperately tries to find. This is the unknown God. This is the forest of idols that are out there in the world. And to think that maybe in our modern secular culture, we've somehow progressed beyond that we don't worship idols anymore, we know that's not true. We're turning to every avenue to try to find some kind of meaning and purpose beyond this world. In that which we so desperately search for, Paul is making the claim that's found in Jesus. That what we're desperately searching for is ultimately found in him. And the good news is that you don't have to grope in the darkness to try to find him. You don't have to ascend to the top of the mountain to try to discover the unknown God. Because the unknown God has made himself known in Jesus, the one who's come to find you. The one who's come to find you and give your life true meaning and value and worth beyond our imagination. So imagine what your life could be like if you lived your life for the one in whom you live and move and have your being. Imagine if you lived for the one who gave his life for you. If you desire to start that journey tonight, maybe you're here and you're not yet a Christian, you're not yet a follower of Jesus. Maybe tonight something has stirred in you and you see the beauty and value and wonder of the God who's come to find you and to save you. Or maybe you find yourself enslaved to the idols of this world. That you once placed your allegiance in Jesus, but now the idols of the world are tearing at you. And you need prayers, you need support, you need repentance to turn around to the God who not only came to find you, but continually seeks you and pursues you. However we can help this night, we ask that you come forward as together we stand and sing.